Welcome to our Elsevier Publishing Campus online lecture, Ways for Researchers to Store, Share, Discover and Use Data. My name is Gwen Holsteeg. I'm Researcher Relations Manager at Elsevier, and I'll be moderating this webinar for you. It will be a 30-minute presentation followed by a question and answer session, and attendees to the live version can submit questions using the Ask a Question button that you can see on screen. If you need technical support, please click the red Live Event Tech Support button. A technician will be on standby if you have any problems. Now, I have the pleasure to hand you over to Helena Poussin, who is Product Manager for Research Data here at Elsevier. Helena, over to you.
Thanks, Gwen. Well, welcome to this webinar about research data. I'm Helena Poussin, Product Manager for Research Data here at Elsevier, which means that I work on initiatives that allow researchers to make their data available. To tell you a bit about my background, I have a PhD in neuroscience, which I did at the University of Oxford, and I studied risk genes for schizophrenia. And to do this, I actually acquired a lot of data and a lot of different kinds of data. So I acquired genetic data, I acquired lab data, I acquired imaging data. And when I came to the end of my PhD, I wasn't actually so sure what to do with all these data. Now, if we take a quick look at the research process, I know that the research process looks quite different for all of you because you're all from different disciplines, so you do very different types of research. But maybe people doing more biomedical research will recognize this, and at least part of the time my research did look like this. So I would go to a lab with all these fridges and freezers, and I would have all these substances that I was working with, for example, antibodies, and then I would have squishy bits, which in my case were usually pieces of brain tissue, and then I would carry out my experiments. And it sounds very easy, but I'm sure you all know that acquiring data and carrying out experiments can take a really, really long time. It can take a year or years to actually acquire all the data you need for your experiment. And then often if you work in a lab, you write down all the details in your lab book. You write down all the things you tried, all the modifications to the protocols. You paste images of your results in there. And so you have a lot of important information in your lab notebook. When you have all the relevant information, you'll interpret the results together with other people from your lab, and then ultimately, if all goes well, you'll write a research paper. Now, this is often the ultimate goal, to do all your research and then write this up in a good paper and communicate to the rest of the world what your findings are. And this is a really important part of doing research. But a remaining question is, what happens to the data? Well, I asked myself this because at the end of my PhD, I published several papers, and one of the journals actually asked me whether my data were available somewhere. So I asked around where I could make my data available, but other people also didn't seem so sure. So even though I thought the data were also very important, I didn't know how to share them with other people. So as I said, data are important, and I think there are several reasons. And there are probably more than I can mention here, but there are a couple that I want to highlight. And the first one is that something can be wrong with the data. And I think we've seen this quite often in the news recently, that data were, for example, falsified or tweaked or just not replicable, and that high-impact papers had to be retracted. You can see an example here. And that's a big problem for science, because when something is published, you assume it's correct, you try to use it and build on it. In some cases, it has a direct application in the clinic or in society. So it's really important that we can trust these findings. And I think that if data would have been available, other researchers would have been able to discover sooner that something was not right. So that would have been a lot more efficient. So a second reason is that data can be reused for other purposes. And the example you see here is data that were maybe not acquired in a research setting, but in a clinical setting, but also data acquired in a research setting when they're available can be used by other researchers. And other researchers can do other types of analysis and discover new things using existing data. And it saves a lot of time and money if they don't actually have to acquire the data again themselves. So something else, and you see this, for example, a lot in genetics, is that data sets are combined. So when you look at the effects of genes, the effects can often be small, so you need very large numbers to be able to detect those effects. And if different institutes work together and make their data available, you get a very large sample, and you can actually detect these small effects. And also, you can not only combine similar data, you can also take data from a somewhat different field and make your research more multidisciplinary, and thereby increase your chances of finding interesting, novel things. So these are some of the reasons I think data is important. But even though data is important, it's currently hard to access. And if you look at the graph here, this is a survey that was done a couple of years ago with almost 4,000 researchers. And if you look at the first arrow, you can see that these researchers said they thought it was important to be able to access data. But you can also see that they said it was not easy to access data. Now, if you look at research articles at the other arrow, that's quite different. Because even though people thought it was even more important to be able to access articles, they also said it was very easy to access articles. And I'm sure that all of you have already looked up an article this week, because it's such a simple thing to do. You don't even have to think about it. You just automatically know how to find the information. But that's currently not the case for data. And one of the reasons that this is not the case is that storage is very fragmented. So researchers often store their data on personal devices, so their computer at work, or an external hard drive, or a personal computer. And by not using general solutions, other people are not able to access these data. And I think that maybe people don't use the general solutions as much because, like me, they don't really know about them, or they think it might be difficult to use them, because often by the time you publish your paper, you will already have started a new research project and you'll be super busy and you don't have time to invest in finding good solutions for your data. And that's also why we really want to provide simple solutions to help researchers store, share, discover, and use data. And that's what I'm talking about today. Now, this is something that we've been thinking about for a while already. I think this year, or maybe last year, data has become a much more important topic. You can now read about it in newspapers, and many different parties are becoming involved in data sharing. But I do think the issue has been around for longer. And already in 2007, Elsevier, together with other publishers, signed the Brussels Declaration. And the Brussels Declaration states that raw research data should be made freely available to all researchers wherever possible. And nowadays, we also have our own research data policy. This research data policy can be found on the website. And we have that to really emphasize that data have our attention, that we think it's really important, and that we want to develop initiatives that allow data sharing. Well, you can see some of these initiatives below. I'll go through them during this talk, but first I really want to emphasize this Brussels Declaration, because I think something that's often a concern for researchers is whether, what will happen to their data. When I publish my data with a publisher, for example, will my data be copyrighted? And I think this Brussels Declaration can take that concern away, because it clearly states that raw research data should be made freely available, so publishers do not copyright your raw research data. Maybe another question that then comes up is, what is raw research data? Well, there's not a very easy answer to that, because that differs a lot from field to field. It's not the same for all disciplines. But the basic idea is that it's the direct results of measurements or observations. These can be automatic or manual, but there can't have been any processing or analyses. It has to be the first data that were acquired, basically, and these data sets can be in different file formats, different sizes, as long as it's the direct result of your measurement. Something else I wanted to mention is the framework that we use here to think about data. And we think about data in terms of research data needs. So what do the data need to be most useful? Because in the end, what we want is that the data are useful and can be reused by other researchers. So I think it's really good to keep something like this in mind when doing your research, so that you can actually think, right, what will my data need to be? Now, if we go through these steps, at the lowest levels, you first have stored. So it's important when you do your experiment that you actually store your data somewhere. Don't just interpret it and then leave it somewhere. Make sure it's stored so that you can look at it again later. And then for the longer term, make sure it's preserved so that it's somewhere where it can stay, well, maybe even indefinitely, and also in a format that can be accessed by others later on. So if you have made sure that you save the data, if you want to share the data, it's important that the data are accessible, so that the data are in a place where others can reach the data as well. And now, it's great if people can access it, but if they can't discover it, they won't access it. So it's also very important to make your data discoverable to other people. Now, something you might not have thought about that much, but something I think is really important, is that you can make data citable. I mean, you're all familiar with the idea of citations, because that's something that's very important when you publish articles, but also research data can be cited. And you can make your data citable by making sure that it has a unique persistent identifier. And I think the most well-known example is the Digital Object Identifier, or DOI. And also research articles have a DOI, maybe you've noticed that already. But for example, several data repositories also give your data set a DOI, and if the data set has a DOI, that's something permanent and something that can be used to cite the data set. And if your data set is cited, that's a way for you to get credit for the work you put into acquiring those data. Now, if we move even higher up in the pyramid, it's important that people trust your data, because if they don't trust it, they might not reuse it. Now, one way to make your data trustworthy is to make them comprehensible, so that when people look at the data, they actually understand what they're looking at and how they could use it. And I think an important part of making the data comprehensible is also to add metadata. And metadata are basically data about the data, so information about the data that you have acquired. Well, another step that's probably also familiar from the whole article publishing process is that data can be reviewed. And if data are reviewed by experts, then people trust them more because experts have said, yes, this is good data and this is something that can be used. Well, if we look at the top of the pyramid, we have reproducible and reusable, and I think these are almost the goals of going through all these steps, that your data will be reproducible and reusable for other people as well. So I think that the different initiatives we have kind of need different data needs. So I will refer back to this pyramid while going over the different initiatives we have. So these are some of the initiatives. From now on, I hope my talk will be quite practical, because I really want you to go away from this talk knowing how you could share your data. So I really want to tell you ways you can do that. Should you publish a paper in the coming months, then hopefully you'll have a good idea of how you could also publish your data with that. Okay, so we're going to start with an initiative which is closely related, I think, to the first example I showed you, and that's an electronic lab notebook. When you write everything down on paper, it's a lot harder to store and preserve it. But if you have an electronic lab notebook, you can basically do the same things as in your normal notebook, but you'll have it installed on your phone or your tablet or your laptop, and you can write down the notes about your experiments. You can upload your protocols and then write down the modifications. You can enter information about the reagents you use, and you can upload files that you acquired, and then you have all this information together, and you'll have it stored in a good way. So this mainly meets the first need in the pyramid. And so the example you're looking at is actually Hivebench. So if you would go to www.hivebench.com, you'd be able to download this and use a lab notebook like this. Now, if you didn't want to just store your data, but you want to take this further, then a data repository is a good option. So Elsevier has actually very recently developed a data repository, and it's so new that it's currently still password protected. I've been told the password will be taken off in the next month, but it's already fully functional. So the password's on the slide, it's alpha, and you can basically already go there and deposit your data should you want to. So it's already in use. So yeah, what you can do there is deposit your research data, and it will also be possible to do that, for example, via an electronic lab notebook. So should you have stored your data there, you can then move it into the data repository. There it will be preserved for the long term, and you can make it public so that it becomes accessible. You can make it discoverable, and it will get a DOI, so it becomes citable. So you can meet a lot of needs by doing that. So yeah, that was a very quick look at the data repository. But we do not only have our own general data repository. We also collaborate with other domain-specific repositories. And we think that that's very important because domain-specific repositories provide a very good place for data, because they can really make sure that they provide the best environment for the kinds of data that are being acquired within that discipline. So that's why we now work with almost 50 domain-specific repositories, and the way we collaborate is that we provide links from articles to the data in those repositories. And I think the need is that it makes the data accessible and it makes the data discoverable through the article. And we link in several ways. One of the ways in which we link is through these data DOIs. So should your data set have a DOI, you can just put that in your paper and that will automatically become a link. So that's a very easy way. Now what we also do is in article accession numbers, and the way you should imagine that is, let's say, for example, you mentioned a gene, then the name of the gene will become a link, and if you click on that link, you'll be taken to the database with information and data on that gene. The other way we do it is through database banners, and that's basically the logo of the database appearing next to the article. And then if you click on that logo, you'll be taken to the website of the database, and you can see the data that the article was based on there. And it's bidirectional, so also from the database there will be a link to the article. So should you have access to data first, you can get more information about the data set by going to the article and reading that. Now, as I said, we're working with almost 50 repositories, and you can see a list on our website. You can see the link here, elsevier.com/database linking. But I also wanted to show you a quick video with the list. So we'll have a look at that now. You can see here's the website with supported data repositories. And you can use a drop-down menu to select the domain, or you can use a drop-down menu to go straight away to the database if you already know which one you want to use. And then there will be some information about the type of linking and about the database itself. So you can go to the home page, and you can also go to an example article to get an idea what it looks like. So here's the article on Science Direct, and here's the logo. And if you click on it, you go to the website of the database, And here you have links to the data sets and information, and also a link back to the article. So this is an illustration of what I just mentioned. So these are the different data repositories that we work with, and we're always very happy to add more, because currently they do not cover all disciplines. So should you know of a particularly good one for your discipline, feel free to send me an email and let me know, because we'd be very happy to get in touch and add that database to the list. So another, I think, very easy way of making your data available is through supplementary material. Well, I'm sure you're very familiar with supplementary material, because there are lots of things you can add to your paper via the supplementary material, and people have been uploading data there for longer. But we now have a quite recent initiative, which is why it's also still called a pilot. And what we do in this open data pilot is that we ask researchers to upload their raw research data, and if they then clearly indicate that this is raw research data, then we make it openly available under a CC BY license. So I already mentioned the CC BY license. It means that everyone can use it, but with proper attribution, so they have to mention that this is your data and they got it via this article. So yeah, this is an easy way to make sure your data are preserved together with your article. They're accessible and they're discoverable through the article, and they're also reviewed, though not very in-depth, but we do ask reviewers and editors to check that the files that have been uploaded contain raw research data as they would expect it in that field. So there is a check on that data as well. So something else which is slightly different but also quite new is the data profile. And the data profile basically provides a description of your data next to your article. And you're asked several questions when entering a data profile. So you're asked what your data looks like, but also where your data are. So here you can provide a description, but also a link to where your data are. And something that I think is important to mention here is that there are obviously cases where you cannot share your data. Now, also in these cases, you can create a data profile, and you can, for example, say, I acquired these data sets, but I'm not able to share them for privacy reasons. And I think in those cases it's still very good to do something like that, because it increases transparency and people understand where the data are, and it makes researchers think about their data. So I think that's very good. Something you might have come across already, because I think it's becoming a bit more widespread, is data journals. And data journals are basically journals in which you can publish data articles. And in data articles, you have the opportunity to provide a description of your data. And I think in many cases, as I already said, you take a lot of time to acquire your data, and you can have very complex data sets, and then it's not always easy for someone else, even if it's very good data, to just take the data and reuse it. And that's why this provides a very good opportunity, because here you can really provide a good description of your data set, how the data were acquired, what the data look like, whether there are any abnormalities, and how the data could be reused. And this can really therefore increase the reuse and really meet the data needs higher up in the pyramid. So really makes your data more comprehensible. The data article is reviewed, so your data are quality checked in that sense, and it really increases the chance of people being able to reproduce or reuse your data. You can still publish a normal research article as well, and then there will be links between your normal research article and your data article, and also there's often a link next to the article to the data set, to a data repository where the data set is held, so you can really provide this complete overview. Okay, and this is, I think, already the last data initiative that I want to show you. It's also slightly different, because this really provides a way of interacting with data within the article, and thereby makes the data more discoverable and comprehensible. And this is a neuroscience example, because this is something that I would use, but in a simpler form, for example, we also have interactive graphs, because sometimes you see a graph in a paper and you're looking at the dots, but you're not actually sure which values they represent. Well, if you have an interactive graph, you can actually click on the dot and you'll get the numbers, so you really know what the data looks like. And in this case, we're looking at a 3D interactive viewer, and I can show you a short movie of what that would look like in the article. So here you see an article on Science Direct, and next to the article you see the 3D viewer, and then you can rotate it yourself to look at it from different angles. You have different ways of viewing it, and you can also view the different figures within the paper in that way, so you can choose another one. And personally, I always like to look at brain images in 2D, and you have that option as well. So you can here pick the 2D view, and then you have different planes, and you can scroll through these to get to the brain activity. You can see that here in red. And then you can view the different planes to really get a very good idea of where, in which brain structures the activity was. So yeah, for several fields there are 3D viewers that allow this kind of interaction. So the last thing I wanted to mention is that we participate in many working groups, and I think this is also very important because, as I said, there's really an increasing interest in research data. And it's also really important that all the different parties working with research data get together to decide on standards and best practices. So there are several organizations. For example, Force 11 came up with a joint declaration of data citation principles, so that there are clear guidelines on how you could cite other people's data and how other people could cite your data. There are also organizations called the Research Data Alliance and the ICSU World Data System, and there publishers get together with people from universities and from libraries and from funding agencies, and together all these different people with an interest in research data can discuss the different perspectives and thereby come up with good standards so that it becomes easier for people to share their data. So I hope this was informative. As I said during my talk, you're very welcome to get in touch if you have any suggestions or if you have any questions or you need more guidance when it comes to sharing your data. You can also find more information on the website, so you can find more information about our initiatives. You can also find our research data policy. So I hope this was helpful, and I'm very happy to hear your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Helene, because this definitely was very insightful in your presentation. Excuse me. So there, in the questions area, we did have a couple, and I'll just take you through them. So one of them concerns the publishing standards to cite data. So there are standards that are being put into place, and how can people get access to what these standards are, and how can they then adhere to these standards? And the other question is, are these standards all unified? So will all publishers use the same standards?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think that's also why it's so important that there are these collaborative efforts where we get together with other publishers and with other parties to talk about these things, because that way we can ensure that it's the same for all publishers. So once you know how to cite a data set, you can use that wherever you publish. So specifically about citing data, Force 11 is the place to go. So if you look at the Force 11 website, they have clear guidelines on how you can cite data. And also with the journals, we increasingly try to provide information so that when you go to the journal website, you will be able to find information on how you can cite data.
And another question that ties into this, so because you also mentioned that researchers could be recognized for the fact that they collect data. So when we talk about citing data and when you look at your citing other people's work and citations that you receive for your own work, how would that work with regards to data?
I think that's also still very much under development. Because, yeah, having your data cited is maybe not worth that much if no one measures whether your data are being cited. So this is also something that we have working groups for. How can we measure how data are used and cited, and how can we give people credit for that? And fortunately, it looks like also funding agencies are starting to look at that, which is very important for researchers, because if funding agencies start taking this into account, you can really be rewarded for sharing your data.
And other questions are centered around the idea of peer review for data. So how are people going to check if data is correct? How will that be organized logistically? So what are your thoughts on that?
That's a difficult question, and I think that's also still very much under development. I think especially now with the data journals, people are thinking about that. And I think the best way would be if someone could really interact with the data, but it's almost impossible to ask reviewers to reproduce the data. So right now we mainly ask them to just look over the data and check that it seems likely, that all the information is there that would allow other people to reuse the data. So it's very much about that. And hopefully, if we become more experienced with this, our standards will also improve.
Yeah, and now we're talking about collecting and sharing data, and I think you mentioned this in your presentation, but I did also receive a question about that. What if you don't want to share your data?
Yeah, so that's possible, of course. I think right now maybe some researchers are reluctant because they feel like, oh, maybe I'll get scooped, or maybe it won't be very good for me to actually make my data available. But funding agencies, again, are thinking about this more and more and are asking this of researchers more and more. So in a way, not wanting to might no longer be enough. On the other hand, if you have a good reason, that's always possible, and when you work with human data, for example, it might not be possible for privacy reasons to share your data, and I think that's something that all journals will always take into account, and that's also why, for example, with the data profile, you have that option as well, to say, unfortunately, I'm not in a position to share the data.
Yeah, and you had a really nice slide at the beginning, where the pyramid slide, where you just put in all the different ways that data can be stored, shared, and all the different uses for the data. I had a question coming in also about if you have data and you store it, can you immediately store it and make it reusable? So from storing, which was at the bottom of the pyramid, and using it at the top, is there a way that it can be stored and immediately made available?
Well, yeah, I think so, actually. I think if you looked at the different initiatives, they meet different needs, but some meet quite some needs. And I think if throughout the research process, if you think about these needs and what you would need to do to make your data reusable, I don't think it would have to take that long at the end to actually get to a stage where people can reuse it. And I think you can also see now that universities are starting to use data management plans. So they ask researchers to make a data management plan before they start the experiments, and that way researchers are already thinking about how they're going to manage the data. And I think that also increases the chances of data being reusable once the experiment is done.
And with regards to different subject areas, because we also got some questions from different subject area approaches, can you say anything about the way data is stored for different subject areas, and if there's anything possible to unify that, or where it's actually very more important to have a different way of doing it for these subject areas?
Yeah, I think it's actually quite funny because maybe you would think that in fields with big data it would be harder, but actually often these fields are already more organized. Because it's more complicated, they've been thinking about it for longer. So you can now see that in fields with really massive amounts of data, with really large file sizes, that they actually already have quite good repositories and quite good ways of sharing the data, and that actually the solutions are needed more for little data, if you can call it that. So I think also if you look at the more general data repositories, the files that are uploaded there are often quite small because those are the types of data that still require a solution.
And I'm coming to the other concerns that are raised, and it's always you hear that also in other areas, but also in this webinar we have a question about that, which is about the copyright data, and also there was a remark about will Elsevier be trying to make money out of the collection of data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think data is really a very open field, so that's something very positive. And I mentioned the Brussels Declaration, where all publishers said that raw research data should be made freely available, and so we do not copyright raw research data. So in that sense, I don't think that has to be a concern at all. I think that because this is such an open field, people shouldn't worry about making their data available.
Now, you mentioned at the beginning that you were a researcher yourself,
mm-hmm.
and so a lot of this that you talk about today is also fueled by your own passion and your own experience. For the people who are listening to this presentation, are there any things that you'd really like them to take away from this presentation that you feel, being a researcher yourself, what is it that you really would like people to understand about data collection and data sharing?
Yeah, maybe two things. That data are very important, but I think everyone knows that because everyone who has acquired data realizes how much work it is and how valuable the data are. And so I think actually my main message is that it's not too difficult to share your data because it's something that I wanted to do and I couldn't really figure out how to do it. And I think with all these new initiatives, it's becoming easier and easier, and therefore, yeah, just go for it. If you have good data, please do share it with other people who will be able to do good research with it as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Helena. This was really interesting, and I would just like to note for the people who are listening that there's a lot of other information on the Publishing Campus available for you as an author, but also as a reviewer. Information about writing and publishing and how editors look at your paper, for example, peer review, promoting your research, which is also a very important step after you've actually published your research. And this information can be accessed on the Publishing Campus in the form of guides or online lectures like this one, even videos. So there's a lot there that you can discover at your own pace. And that's it from now, and I would like to thank everybody and Helena yourself for this presentation.